This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the third week of August 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. You know these guys. This is Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com, the fresh-cut Eric Jackman of the MMA Hour. You know him as New York Rick. And, of course, the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall, also of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, let's get right into it because we have some breaking news here. We thought we were going to find out what was happening to Wanderlei Silva, what kind of punishment he would receive for skipping out on that drug test back in May. And then we find out just moments before the Nevada Athletic Commission hearing that they are postponing his portion of the hearing because his lawyer, Ross Goodman, has filed a complaint saying that they have no jurisdiction to give him any disciplinary action because he wasn't licensed at the time to fight in Nevada. He had a fight coming up at UFC 175, but he had yet to apply for a license. Very similar to the Vitor Belfort situation. Vitor took the test and then kind of got an unofficial suspension. Wanderlei ran away from the test, and now we find out he may have a leg to stand on. Do you think he does?
Well, he has a leg. He had a leg to run on, and we made fun of him for it. We made fun of him for it. I made fun of him. We all did. Yeah. And it turns out that he did what he had a right to do, which is just mind-blowing. I mean, we were, coming in here today thinking this was going to be the chance for us to, to pile on, basically, because, you hear that whole image of the tester coming in the front door and Wanderlei running out the back door. We make fun of him, and it turns out that if you're not licensed, you have no obligation to go through with a test. It's kind of like the bizarro world of drug testing, and in the end, we're going to reschedule his hearing. Mm-hmm. But what are they going to do? What are they going to do to Wanderlei Silva if he did have the right to not undergo a test? What can they possibly do?
Yeah, but here's the other side of the coin, right? Sure. He was booked for a fight. He was at a press conference. We knew he was going to fight. It was a formality that he was going to apply for a license. So it's not like they just picked a random date out of the hat and say, we're going to test you. He was going to fight Nevada. So shouldn't he have to take the test?
No. I mean, if it's in the rules that he doesn't have to take the test, then he doesn't have to take the test. If that's how we're going to start giving jurisdiction where, oh, we think that this is the case. No, whatever's written in the book is how it has to be done. And if he doesn't have to take the test, then he should be perfectly able to run out the back door, do whatever he has to do to refuse the test. It's more, I think, obviously he has a leg to stand on. I think it's more of a question of what is the NSAC's case against him? Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like they have much of one. If they're not allowed, he's allowed to refuse the test, then I don't see where they have any leg to stand on.
Now, we should be clear. I don't believe that it explicitly says you are allowed to, walk away or run away, but it does explicitly say licensee. So it obviously then implies that you must be licensed to receive any kind of disciplinary action if you fail a test or run away from a test. He was not licensed at the time. He had yet to apply for a license. He had yet to meet the commission to do so because he's over the age of 35, and that's the rule in Nevada. You have to appear in front of them like Yoel Romero did today. So in my opinion, it's very much like the Vitor Belfort situation. Vitor took the test, and then, like I said, he received this unofficial suspension, kind of 9 months, and you can't fight outside of Nevada, all this stuff. Wanderlei, last time he was in front of Nevada, he never brought this up. He brings it up now. Kind of strange, right?
Very strange, and it plays out as one of those things like, well, here's a technicality that we didn't foresee. Ultimately, you'd like to believe if the UFC puts him, he was supposed to be on UFC 173. So we're thinking that this fight's happening in May, not July, originally. That these things were already taken care of. Well, as soon as he's announced the tickets are on sale, you'd like to think they're in conjunction with one another, that there's not an asterisk placed to this fight that says pending license, because you assume, well, I think we all assumed, or I assumed that was not going to be a big deal. That was just a formality that was going to be gotten through. And then it all comes back like this, and you'd like to just see them be more in orchestra with one another. UFC, particularly with the Nevada State Athletic, they always, or the Nevada Athletic Commission, they always, the UFC always says they defer to the Athletic Commission anyway. This is one of those things, you're like, well, this is another thing where don't you guys need to be on the same page before you go through these things? I know that you want to give the benefit of the doubt to your fighters, but, guys like Wanderlei Silva that have the asterisk anyway, they're always a little bit like that. If you know that, maybe you suspect that there might be some strange things that might happen beforehand, but we don't know the full circumstance, and then it all comes out like this, and here we are on the day of his actual hearing getting all this. And think about the UFC. We were talking about it off camera. You know, setting up their Fight Pass thing, this whole thing that goes through with it, and it's just it's
and
another
they received this
turn.
complaint August 15th. So
Yeah.
Nevada has known about this complaint for the last 6 days.
Right, and you know, we've seen in past hearings that the Nevada Commission does things that a lot of us think are just, you know, sort of bizarre and just unprofessional. And this seems to be another example of that. Why would they put this on their agenda if they were then going to just table it if they knew about this in advance?
Wanderlei wasn't even in Nevada.
And it also calls into it also calls into question what Chuck started to bring up about, you know, the UFC having always talked about being, you know, we're regulated by the government. That's the Dana White quote over and over again. We've heard it. It would be really great if at some point, because I don't think these regulations are going to change. I don't think that they're going to change it so that guys are mandated to take testing before their license. But it would be great if the UFC were to put a new provision in their contracts with fighters and say, you know, you've just signed a contract to fight on this date. Well, from this day going forward, you must take whatever test comes out. Then you may not have some kind of problem with the commission, but you'd have a problem with the UFC. The UFC needs to take a more active role. If they really are serious about ridding the sport of drugs, they can't just sit back and let the Nevada Commission run the roost, because it's just not happening. They're not doing enough. And the UFC talks about wanting to do more. This would be a great example. This would be a really great move for them to take.
I would just want to say that this speaks to something that coincidentally Chael Sonnen raised when he was playing dumb at his hearing, which is when he makes the case that, I don't know, things are confusing. Things are confusing. Everything's not laid out. If Vitor Belfort knew that he wasn't mandated to take that test, he wouldn't have taken the test, and he would have probably been cleared. So there has to be a better dissemination of information to the fighters. They have to know what they can and cannot do, what they are mandated to do. If Wanderlei did not have to take that test, and he wasn't a licensee at the time, then he's well within his right, and every fighter should know that.
And another side effect of this whole thing is now we're still stuck in this morass of the Wanderlei Silva. You know, here we go. We're going to have to you know, kind of go through this whole process of what happens next with Wanderlei Silva.
Yeah.
So it's one of those. It's a situation where it's sort of, he hasn't fought, and I think it's a year and a half at this point. He wasn't. It's strange when you're talking about a guy like Vitor Belfort, who's coming off of what he had done in 2013. There's intrigue there. To me, this is a guy who's 38 years old. He had sort of been trading wins and losses. I don't think that his relevancy was quite to where it was at. It was just he was on a reality show that we were sort of, you know, forced into kind of caring about. I felt like a little bit. It was sort of, you know, it wasn't an organic thing. It was like we sort of were put there, and here we are still talking about him. It's just the whole thing is just kind of going on too long.
The saga continues. I mean, really, you'd love to put a bow on this whole thing and move on. I do think it's important to note that while you want to believe Wanderlei that he is clean, and yes, he wasn't licensed. The UFC has confirmed this to me, that he was not licensed to fight in Nevada. It expires every year, so if you have a fight coming up, if you don't fight in Nevada for a couple of years, of course you don't have a license because there's no need to apply for one. But the fact that he ran away, you know, if he would have said to them, hey guys, I'm not licensed, what are you asking me to do this for? Then you could be like, all right, you know, he has a point. But the fact that he ran away, ran out the back door, makes you feel like...
Do we have that's really what happened, or is that just Chael Sonnen's version?
No,
Does anybody else
because you remember 2 hearings ago, the tester was in front of the commission and ran through his timeline of events and essentially laid it out that way. But we also have to, and you were just doing this to a degree, we also have to point the finger at Nevada. This is the second time this year that they ask a guy to take a test who just wait for him to apply and then go after him. Don't put the cart before the horse here. You know what I'm saying? It's a big mistake, and they got lucky with Vitor in a sense that he took the test. Now I feel like there's egg on their face.
Yeah, well, there's like a dozen eggs on their face. I mean, it's like and more to come. And I, you know, jumping off of what Chuck said about the relevancy of Silva, I think that this becomes about something other than Wanderlei Silva. I mean, sure, I don't think that I would make the presumption that he was clean. I'm not going to say that he wasn't clean, but I'm certainly not jumping to the conclusion that he was. If a tester comes in the door and he runs out, you know, we can jump to whatever. We're not a jury, so we can make whatever assumption we want to. But the fact that he can get away with that, that speaks to a much bigger topic that the sport really has to deal with. And it's not really about Wanderlei Silva running out the door. It's more about as you say, the Nevada Commission just not really putting its ducks in a row. And the UFC standing off to the side and saying, well, these are the guys that are regulating the sport. We're just going to stand here. But if they really, really want to clean up the sport, they can't wait for those guys to act. They got to do something.
So now we're going to see this battle between Team Wanderlei Silva and Nevada arguing about the terminology, licensee, and who has the jurisdiction. So again, the saga continues. We'll talk more about drug testing later on in the show, but let's talk about some potentially exciting news for UFC fans. Eddie Alvarez is now a member of the UFC. He was released by Bellator Tuesday in a very non-Bjorn Rebney move. They just announced that he is done, and moments later, hours later, the UFC announced that he is fighting at UFC 178, which is essentially a month and change away, and he's fighting Donald Cerrone in a fight that has been rumored for quite some time. Bobby Green gets the short end of the stick. He gets bumped from the card. Jorge Masvidal fighting James Krause, of course. But the big news, finally, the saga of Eddie Alvarez versus Bellator is over, and Scott Coker proves that he is not like the old regime, that he isn't going to hold a grudge, and if you don't want to be here, you can go away. So first, let's talk about this from a Bellator perspective. We'll start with you, Eric. Was this the right call? Because he did have one fight left on his contract. He was the champion. You could roll the dice that he loses. You need the big names. He is a face of Bellator, one of the original stars. Was it the right call to release him once they came to the realization that he doesn't want to fight there?
I mean, unequivocally. Like, it's time to move on from Bjorn Rebney's era. It's time to curry good favor, and they've done that. And they've turned themselves back into an organization that fighters will respect more, rather than kind of think that they're going to have some kind of shady dealings. The whole thing of Eddie Alvarez being caught up in court just left a bad taste in people's mouth. They needed to cut ties, move on with this, and let Eddie Alvarez do what he wanted to do, which the whole time has been go to the UFC.
It's one of those things where the acrimony has sort of sat in the public for so long that at this point, what better perfect time than you bring it, and the Scott Coker comes in, he's going to do things a different way. They do it. It just makes them look good, and it, opens up the pool of possibilities, honestly, for Eddie Alvarez, who most people, going back to my ESPN days when you'd write up the rankings, the top 3 or 4 guys were Gilbert Melendez, Frankie Edgar at the time, Benson Henderson was sort of floating around there, and then Alvarez. And now you've got all these guys finally who are under one thing, and that pool of possibility has been what we wanted. That's what makes it fun, with the idea of him coming over. It's finally to that point, the Cowboy Cerrone thing. We were talking on Monday about how, that the fight that stood before it, and I was saying, it would have been a lot better had they had that fight on there. It would have made it a little bit more of intriguing, just with Eddie Alvarez coming over from a truth teller standpoint, like that sort of thing, this intrigue. Well, here it is, and I feel like everybody sort of benefits. Bellator looks way better than they had in the past. Like, they finally look like, a fighters organization. I think they were sort of placing themselves as a place that fighters and managers didn't want to deal with for a long time there.
Well, Eric mentions the Bjorn Rebney era, and I wasn't sure if you meant era ERA or ERROR, because he was a guy. He was a guy who seemed like no matter what Bjorn did, he was going to get criticism for it. And Scott Coker, I mean, you always want to come in, if you're coming to a new job, you always want to follow a guy who the bar has been set pretty low, maybe it's through some fault of Rebney, but also just circumstances dictated that. And so Scott comes in, and now the fighters are going to like him because he did this. Fans, even fans who are big Bellator fans, maybe they don't like the idea of losing a guy like this, but they're gonna reap the benefits, because now when UFC trims the roster again, people are going to start thinking, or even when their contracts come up, they're going to start thinking of Bellator as a fighter-friendly place. And this is but don't lose your eye on the prize here. Scott Coker didn't just do this thing to be a nice guy. This was a really smart move business-wise for him, and this is something that's going to push Bellator toward being a place that just has really good, exciting fights. They don't need to have. Chuck and I were having this conversation as we were coming in. It's not like the UFC that wants to have this big, deep division in every single weight class. They just need a few guys sprinkled through all those weight classes who are big attractions. And if they can get a few more of those, and maybe toward doing that, lose one guy, it's going to be a win for them.
I think they're lucky to a degree that they have an interim champion in Will Brooks, so that now there's no vacated title. They could just make Will Brooks the champion. But let's play devil's advocate. They need all the big fights that they can get. Eddie Alvarez, like I said, he's been there since day one. He's a big name. a fight against Chandler, a third fight, a fight against Brooks is a big fight. Why not just have him fight that last fight? They lost Lombard as champion. They lost Askren as champion. They're still around. Why not keep him for that last fight? What do you think? Anyone? No one thinks it's a good idea.
I would have loved to have seen him. But truthfully, it's unfortunate the way it played out because Will Brooks stood in there and beats Chandler so that trilogy fight between Alvarez and Chandler loses something in the transition. So I feel like at that point, it's such a finite pool between that three piece and everything else that you're almost like, why wait at this point?
Yeah, if Chandler had won that fight against Brooks, then that trilogy still has, all that power, and I don't think they would have done this. I mean, I think they would have said, well, at least we'll get this one big fight left out of it. But, as one of you guys pointed out earlier, there is that risk because if Eddie Alvarez, walks away with the belt and, sort of slings it over his shoulder and then walks over to the UFC.
It's a bad look.
Yeah, it's not a good thing.
So the UFC wastes no time. They announced, really just hours later, they announced that he is now a member of the team and he is fighting Donald Cerrone at UFC 178 in the co-main event. And I think this is a valid co-main event in case you're wondering. So
it's just the second to last fight.
Right, well, that too. It's both. What do you think of this fight? What do you think of this fight as far as a introduction to the UFC audience? He is the Bellator champion. I mean, some people, you can make the case that he deserves the winner of Gilbert Melendez versus Anthony Pettis. What do you think? Do you think this was the right call right off the bat for him?
If he wants to prove that he's here to make a claim to the belt, then this is the best fight that he can get. Donald Cerrone is fighting as well as he has in his entire career. If he can beat Donald Cerrone, which I think he's a slight underdog at this point when the odds were released, it would be a huge statement for Eddie Alvarez coming over from Bellator to the UFC, saying, all along, I was good enough to be here. I was good enough to be champion. The rankings that you were doing 5, 6, 7 years ago were right. I belonged there, and I belong here.
I love that he calls himself the underground king. And those guys are few and far between these days, right? I mean, how many guys fought in the Japan era, right, of MMA that are still lingering out there that have yet to taste the UFC, the waters and whatnot. And now here they are. He comes into the UFC and he gets a big fight. I wonder, a win over Cerrone, is that enough? He says he wants to get a title shot. Is that enough in your opinion, considering what he's done up until this point?
If it was another division, what's crazy about the 155 division is always just stuffed to the gills with guys who could make that claim. And Nurmagomedov being a guy like that, obviously he's injured, but you have a lot of guys in that space. Donald Cerrone, I mean, he's like you said, he's fighting as well as he is. To beat him would be a great marker, but you also have the timing of when Pettis is going to fight. I mean, that comes into play. I doubt it. I think it's just going to, when you come down to it, it'd be the timing factor plus is Cerrone enough. I think he'll still have to fight at least somebody else. I think so. I mean, would it be necessary? No, not really. I mean, I think that. He's proven himself. I really believe that the guys he's fighting in Bellator, a couple of those guys, obviously, the Chandler fights really show because I believe Chandler is a really good fighter. So to me, that's evidence enough that he belongs where he's at. Beating Cerrone on his hot streak and everything else, to me that would be enough. But ultimately with the timing and everything else, and plus the other guys who are sort of in that space, hovering around that have been waiting, I don't know. I doubt it. I doubt he gets the next crack.
It's sort of the story, though. I mean, I think that's where the, I make the mistake of thinking that the UFC, awards title bouts out of merit. I mean, and I know that I've been on here and I've made that, I've talked about that to the people who are tired of hearing about it, but I'm starting to realize after all this time that that's not really what it's about.
Timing is probably the biggest factor, right?
Timing, but it's also the story. So let's say that people have talked about Alvarez against Gil Melendez a lot over for years.
It was almost made.
And if Melendez ends up the champion, that fight might be one that people want to jump into. So maybe the UFC lets them jump a few spaces ahead. Who knows? I mean, but I think that what's really cool about this event is that now by putting this fight into UFC 178, this becomes like kind of from an anthropological perspective, it's like we're mining into a whole different realm of pay-per-view because pay-per-view traditionally has been all about the main event. That's why people buy a pay-per-view, and the main event is what sells the pay-per-view. Well, in this case, we've got a main event that. I love Demetrius Johnson, but this is not a fight that has any appeal. I mean, every other fight he's done, I've wanted to see. This is one that he should just roll over this guy. But there's a really great undercard below him with with Cerrone and Alvarez heading it. And so are people going to go out there and buy this fight card thinking, well, the main event isn't all that exciting, but look at this fight, look at that one, look at that one, look at that one. Is that going to be enough, or are people going to just do what they always do, which is look at the main event, say, I don't think so, and then it gets wasted?
You guys are basketball guys, right?
Yeah.
2012, 2013 Denver Nuggets. They had Carmelo. They had 57 wins that year. It was their best, franchise from 1977 when they came in the league. Big deal for people in Denver that to have that. But they had lost Carmelo Anthony. They got rid of him. They fleeced the team. I forget how he's somewhere, but they fleeced it. But they put together basically 2 starting units. I mean, they had so much depth below it. So you were missing the star. You were missing having a star, but you had all this depth below it. And it's like, that's what it reminds me of this card. It's like you have, they were very good. It's still very, very good. But without that star, it's sort of like, it loses something. There's not a Carmelo Anthony there anymore, but you've got this great, the rest of it's really looks good.
Or even a Dan Issel.
Yeah, Dan Issel.
I think fans have been clamoring for this type of card. I think that the conversation has always been, I'm tired of the fight cards where if John Jones gets injured, the whole thing falls out.
Sure.
People have been begging for this type of fight card. So now we'll see if this is what they really wanted. Because if you don't pay for this one, you've proven that all you're really interested in is John Jones versus TBD.
That fight is so huge. If you were just to take it,
which one? Jones Cormier?
Jones Cormier.
Yeah.
So you lose it, and it leaves this huge thing. But let's say it was just another, it was. Chris Weidman was fighting Vitor Belfort, something slightly less. It's not as blown up. Would you look? I don't know how much it would. You look at the rest of this card, and it's so good. You almost are like, I'd rather it have a weak title fight with all that depth than the reverse. But it's a little skewed on this one because the title fight that they lost out on was so big.
Yeah.
But if it was something else, I feel like this card is just, it still looks
so then let me
really
ask
good.
you guys this. They took Demetrius Johnson versus Chris Carriasso from UFC 177 next weekend in Sacramento, and they moved it to the main event of UFC 178. Now, it's clear that they wanted to do Cerrone versus Alvarez this whole time. Right. They just kind of ran out of time. They threw us a curveball, but at the end of the day, they got their fight. Did they need to make that switch? Because how many people are actually going to buy 178 for the title fight? And one could make the case that 177 needs that fight more. They needed the appeal of the two. Did they need to? Could 178 have existed with Cerrone Alvarez as the main event?
Of course.
McGregor, Poirier, all those great fights. Did they almost make a mistake by making that switch?
I think so. I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about is you lose the one thing, but you have all that intrigue below it. And I would say that the title fight doesn't have that sort of intrigue. It was better off in the slot it was in. It sort of fortified that card where they probably needed it a lot more. To me, the intrigue is obviously Conor McGregor just had this ridiculous thing. He's got Dustin Poirier who wants to defend the whole featherweight division and beat this guy and all this. I mean that storyline by itself, and you figure he's going to be promoting that fight very well. And now you have Alvarez come over, and you have Dominic Cruz on the card who would then be on the main card rather than the prelims, presumably. I mean, to me, that card has enough. It doesn't really need that. But I know that the UFC is very defiant about this, like having their flyweight, or it doesn't matter, they want a belt in play. And, right now they're in I believe that it's almost like a sort of a middle finger to anybody who would dare dare say that they can't do it, because people have been coming at Dana White, and he's getting defensive about it, so he's putting it back on there. So we'll just have to see how that part plays out, but it has enough in my mind.
Typically, you do want a title fight on a pay-per-view. That's just the way they always do it. But this would have been an interesting study for them, because it's such a strong card.
But it's missing that superstar, right?
It is, but it's a lot of it's like if Eddie Alvarez calls himself the underground king, this would be like the undercard king. It would be of fight cards, because it would be a lot of really good fights. And I don't know that they're going to sell many more pay-per-views with the title fight on it. But I will tell you that without the title fight on 177, I think they're going to sell a lot fewer. Because even if you didn't think that 177 has a lot of depth, which it really doesn't, at least it had two fights that where a title was on the line. And even if you're not a big fan of the lighter weight guys, there's two of them. I mean, I think that was going to carry the day. But now you've got 177 with just one title fight, and then you've got 178, which almost didn't need it in a sense.
Yeah. And what do you think of them putting Dominic Cruz on the undercard? It's a great main card, but he's now the headlining act of the prelims. And let's be honest, these days, the prelims are seen more often than not by more people than the pay-per-view. The intrigue, though, of him coming back after such a long layoff, I feel would get some people to, pluck down $55. What do you think?
It may have been too long ago for people to remember this, but there was a time where Dominic Cruz was considered a boring fighter. There were a lot of people.
Right.
Maybe it was a vocal minority, but there were people who weren't interested in seeing Dominic Cruz.
He was kind of in that DJ territory, right?
It's exactly where DJ was. So maybe this is the right spot for him to see. He's going to headline the undercard. As you said, a lot of people are going to be watching this, and maybe this was the right debut. I don't think you necessarily have to throw him back on pay-per-view. Let's see where he's at, and then we'll play it from there.
At the same time, though, if that's the table setter, if the risk of him being a boring fighter, maybe not in the same form, they're using him as the table setter to the pay-per-view, which is also a little bit confusing because there's a chance that it's not the most exciting fight and that sort of thing. It's a little confusing. If I'm sort of with you guys, I think that in an intrigue sense, for the people who've sort of followed him, I mean, he's pretty fascinating fighter ultimately. If you really like the sport, like just the way he moves, everything else about him. He could have been part of that intrigue, part of that pay-per-view package, and I would have been, you're getting more for your buck.
It's a story in itself that he's coming back, and how rare is that? That's a spectacle, right?
3 years.
I feel like
almost.
Kennedy, Romero, Zingano, Nunes, all great fights, great stories. Cruz is, I pay, when he was going to fight Barao, I didn't care about the rest of that was just big. He was back. And he's been a part of the Fox Sports family. Maybe that's one of the reasons why. And he's certainly very proud of the fact that he's fighting on Fox and the statement that he told me. So I think that's a very interesting move.
Well, I was going to say that it's not always about how the fight is going to turn out. That it really is. You really want to use that position, and I believe. I know sometimes we make fun of the main event of the undercard or whatever they call it, main event of the prelims. But I actually believe that's a real thing with pay-per-views. I think that's you want to get something that people are going to tune into.
The table setter, right?
They want it, and if it's and Dominic Cruz, people are really intrigued by seeing him, and if people tune in, and the whole time that they're waiting for that fight to happen, and the immediate aftermath. Rogan is going to be selling the pay-per-view, and he's going to get on with Dana White, and they're going to sell that pay-per-view hard, presumably to a lot of eyes. A lot of eyes are going to be watching Dominic Cruz, so I think it's the right place for him.
And how about this? Patrick Cote, who's coming off a big win. Masvidal, who's on a roll. Cruz, they're all on the undercard. 177 compared to that, those fights could be on the pay-per-view for 177. It's amazing. One last thing on the whole Eddie Alvarez situation. I do find it's a little bit ironic that, remember, Eddie Alvarez was almost begging Scott Coker to make the Gilbert Melendez fight. And then at the end of the day, Scott Coker is the one who gives him the, the out-of-jail card to go to the UFC. And I also think they deserve some credit, Bellator does, because... And I don't mean to say that they did this in a malicious way, but by releasing him, by getting ahead of the game, they may have taken away some of his leverage with the UFC. I mean, where did he have to go at the end of the day? So maybe that's why the deal got done so quickly. Was he going to play that game with ONE FC or WSOF? I doubt it. So, I think from all points of view, they really played their cards very well there, and a sign that there is indeed a new era in Bellator. Now let's go back to drug testing. On Saturday in Macau, Michael Bisping and Kung Lee are going to go toe-to-toe. And just yesterday, Michael Bisping told MMAJunkie.com, when discussing this now infamous Kung Lee photo that's been making the rounds, saying that he would love to see blood and urine testing after this fight, but he didn't think that this was going to happen for whatever reason. Well, Dana White tells me that in fact, they will be subjected to blood and urine testing, enhanced testing as he called it after the fight. And this is significant. The UFC is doing this on their own. They are the governing body over there. There's no athletic commission in Macau. Now, some journalists in our sport, notably Kevin Aioli on Twitter, was saying that this is a waste of money. Why are they doing this after the fact? The way to catch these cheaters, if they are cheaters, is to do random testing before the fight, etc., etc. Other people like myself, as I said to him, say, you're right, random testing clearly works, but something is better than nothing at this point. What do you think of them doing this after the fact and making it public when it was clear Michael Bisping didn't know that this was going to happen?
Yeah, that part's the part that I have a problem with. Not so much that they're doing the testing. I understand where people are saying that they should be doing this, they should be getting ahead of themselves, and then doing it on fight night is not the best position. But letting people know about it, I think is it's a strange position to be if you're a journalist. You want to be finding out information and reporting it, but in terms of being the promotion, you don't really want to let that know. You don't want that to get out. You want it to be something that we find out about afterward, after it happens. And I think that was the mistake. Not so much creating the test, but letting people know about it, because now it's been out there for a day or so, and anybody who might have been on something, because there are drugs that do not show up in the test, in the urine tests that they normally do on a Saturday night. So there could be some people that would have been caught on Saturday night, but now probably not.
I tend to think that Rome wasn't built in a day, and we're all kind of learning about this on the fly, and they are clearly trying to do the right things to clean the sport up. And I don't think it's a waste of money, because we would criticize them if they weren't testing, right? I mean, maybe the timing or the way that they announced it, or maybe they shouldn't have, told me or whatever. But you can't say it's a waste of money to test people, right?
And are we balancing the UFC's budget? Why do we care if they're wasting money?
Sure.
This is a step in the right direction. What's the help me understand the argument against it. I can't. For the life of me, I can't. We're taking steps in the right direction. More testing is better than no testing, period. End of story.
You know what I like is I like that it's telegraphed a little bit so that these guys don't get caught off guard.
Yes.
It seems like, no. But to me, it's like, if there's an outcry, this thing was going on, it just sort of saves face. It's like one of those keeping the faith type of things that's going to happen.
Sure.
I have no big problem. I agree with what you're going to say. That was going to be my point as well. It's not our job to worry about how the UFC spends their money in that sense. But I will say this. They wanted to make sure there was going to be a main event. If you're going to, do these things far out in advance, you're always putting that in jeopardy. From a promotional standpoint, that doesn't make much sense.
I also want to know why who's out there photoshopping Kung Lee's head on top of a picture of Chuck Mindenhall, because that was just
that was just a good lighting day for me, boys. That was fun.
Well, and that was his, I guess his story, and he gave a very long answer. But you could say that, look, there were these questions, and they're letting you know that, hey, they're not incriminating anyone. Bisping is going to be subjected to the same test, but they're just letting you know, look, this is coming out, and just in case you guys were wondering, they will be subjected to the testing. But everyone agrees that random testing is better, and so this is a bit of an interesting angle going into this fight. But I think this fight doesn't really need any more angles. There's a lot at stake here for both men.
It's so tough because you had Mark Bocek on your show
a
couple weeks ago. And he's speculating, he's saying like, 90% of people doing something sounds about right. I mean, you hear that type of thing and you're like, wow, it's an infestation. There's so many drugs.
Epidemic.
Yeah, it's an epidemic. Everybody's doing it. You're never sure. Obviously, this is all speculation, but you're a promotion. Are you trying to pluck out all of your guys? I mean, it's just, are you going to test the hell out of everybody in advance and then lose your event? I mean, it's just...
Well, that's where the commissions come into play.
Yeah, absolutely.
But people say, like, how stupid do you have to be to fail a test when you know it's happening? Well, how many guys have actually failed tests? Like, the random drug testing thing, let's not forget, this is kind of new to MMA. How many guys have failed post-fight urine tests, not even blood tests? So to dismiss this and say, like, oh, it's announced, and, they're obviously going to pass it now, maybe not. Tons of guys have failed much easier tests, and they knew they were coming. So I don't think it's fair to dismiss it. But let's talk about the actual fight itself. I mean, I think there is a lot at stake here, more so for Michael Bisping because of the maybe unrealized potential. He never got the title shot, arguably the most popular fighter in UFC history to never get a title shot. I believe he's tied with Gleison Tibau for most wins in UFC without getting a title shot. And now here he is coming off a lackluster performance against Tim Kennedy. He lost that fight back in April. He needs a win going up against Kung Lee, who hasn't fought in almost 2 years, and obviously up there in age, he's 42 years old. Do you agree that there's more pressure on Michael Bisping on Saturday morning in Macau?
Yeah, of course. I don't think Kung Lee is within shouting distance of anything resembling a title shot.
It almost feels like he's okay with being in this place of just having these marquee fights and not really going for the gold.
Yeah, whereas Bisping isn't okay with that.
Yeah.
Now, if he goes out and sets that record and becomes the guy with the most fights, most victories in the UFC without a title shot, if he goes out and no matter what he does to Kung Lee, he's not going to get a title shot off of that, not even close. But if he goes out and loses, it'll never happen. And so in a way, he's he's sort of finding that life raft, you know. And the life raft is out there, but it's still pretty far out in the ocean, and he's going to have to do a lot more to paddle his way toward that glorious island that he's hoping to find. But hey, man, just what you got to do if he still talks about being a champion, you know, whether that's realistic or not realistic, but if he goes out there on Saturday and doesn't win, he could stop talking.
What do you think? Could this be the end?
I mean, how many times have we heard this about Michael Bisping?
Really?
I feel like we've heard it a lot. I feel like the shot against Vitor was his last shot. If he doesn't make it here, he'll never get another shot. Against Kennedy, this is do or die.
But this is not so much about shots. This is about being relevant. I think title shots are far away, especially in a stacked middleweight division, right?
I don't think title shots are far away, and I think he'll be as relevant after that fight, even if he loses, that he was before. Really? I don't think he loses anything or can lose anything.
If he gets knocked out like Franklin did, you don't think he suffers?
Not at all. He's one of these fighters who's been around so long, and he's kept himself in such great condition that he'll be relevant into his late 30s, and he'll be always a guy that they can throw on a marquee and everybody will say, that's Michael Bisping, I want to see him fight. Dan Henderson just fought Daniel Cormier. This wasn't that long ago, and that had title implications, maybe. We don't really know.
He's coming off a win, though.
Okay, but Michael Bisping can pick up a win over somebody and get right back into the picture. I honestly feel like we've heard this too much with Bisping. Maybe you don't feel that way. But every time he gets close and perhaps doesn't cross that threshold, against Sonnen, arguably he did, people bury him, he's gone, he'll never be relevant again, he'll never get a title shot. I'm just kind of over that. I think that if he wins, he's right back in the picture, and if he loses, he'll be right back where he was before the fight, honestly. I don't think there's much to gain either, though.
What picture? What is the picture you're talking about? You say he's back in the picture.
Title picture. I think that he can contend for a title. I think that if
he loses on Saturday,
absolutely.
This isn't the era of Talis Ladies getting a title shot. There are legitimate contenders lining up.
But if he gets into it, let's say he loses. Kung Lee's a dangerous opponent, so that's not out of the question. But then somebody falls out of another fight, he gets put into it, and he beats them. How many times has that happened? He will be right back in the title picture because he's a name that they will throw into one of those fights if somebody falls out. He will be fine. Michael Bisping will be fine.
What do you think?
I don't know. Michael Bisping is. You look back at his previous losses. We've talked about this all the time. He's fighting guys who are right there in contention. The guys he lost to, Chael Sonnen, whom he arguably might have beat. Vitor Belfort in his asterisk phase down there in Brazil. These are the guys. So his viability was sort of kept intact by sort of having these things. Dan Henderson at that time at UFC 100 was also vying for a title shot. And he ended up going to Strikeforce and doing his thing. He's just. I feel like this is different. He lost a lackluster fight, like you just said, to Tim Kennedy. This is a guy, a grinder type of guy who was able to do that to him, a guy who had previously not been exposed by even grinders. Guys who wanted to do that to him couldn't. This was a little bit of a fall off. That's a competitive fall off from where we put Michael Bisping before. Now, if he goes in and he loses to Kung Lee, who's 42 years old, this is different from those types of contenders. You're on a 2-fight streak that suddenly drops you below the types of things. You're starting to lose out on excuses. Now, will he remain able to? I don't think he's able to retain his relevancy in the title picture, is what I'm saying. But I think he'd be able to, because there's enough guys who hate him, enough guys who want to fight him, that he'll get that chance. Maybe you're right if a guy like Luke Rockhold is able to ascend to a certain level, and for some reason they come together and he's able to leapfrog.
Well, the brilliance of Michael Bisping is he's always 2 fights ahead. He has a fight with Rockhold. I don't know if the UFC wants to make that Rockhold fight. Obviously Daniel Cormier breaking on UFC tonight.
I mean, that's what he does.
That's Chael Sonnen 101. Yeah. He's always 2 fights ahead, so he's always relevant. But I tend to think that a loss against Kung Lee does a lot of damage, not so much for his title aspirations, but just for his place in the division. Now, let's move along because we're running out of time. Hector Lombard was supposed to fight on this card, and he generated some headlines this week because he has decided to change his nickname. He went from Hector Lightning Lombard. He wasn't really known as Lightning, but now he's calling himself Hector Showweather.
I'm glad he didn't go with Poisondorf or whatever Michael Bisping called him.
And this might be like our co-main event discussion of last week, semantics, and it doesn't really mean anything. But I'm getting kind of tired of guys picking their nicknames. I mean, we've seen this a lot. Miesha Tate calling herself Cupcake. Even Josh Barnett calling himself the War Master, and he had a really good one. And people left and right picking their own nicknames. This is a problem. I think this is an epidemic in MMA. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
This is a big problem.
Yeah, well,
I want to see an NAC hearing about this.
You know what, man? You're not Beast in 25-8, and if you were,
I'd like to know who gave him that nickname. What do you think?
You can't pick your own nickname.
You can't.
Period. End of story.
We should just ignore it, right?
That's not his nickname.
Yeah.
If we haven't given it to you, or if people around you have not given it to you, it's not your
people's
nickname.
champion.
some people like Jesse Water Bongfield. Like if he get,
That's
I don't know
pretty
who-
brilliant. That's pretty brilliant.
I don't think so.
Okay.
The ones that I can't, the ones that get me are, I've thought about this before. This very conversation. Like the ones that get me are like the Portmanteaus when they, like J Lo, Joe Lo Zombie and J Lo, Ken Flo. Hendo. I'm like,
You don't like
J
that.
Wags. I mean, come on, it's just.
But at least they didn't give it to themselves.
Well, I don't know if they
We
give it to
don't know.
themselves.
It's
or
a
not.
marketing war.
Mid-career, you can't do that.
It's all about marketing and who's going to market you. You don't want somebody else to define who you are.
True.
So you want to take the reins and market yourself. You want to
Big Brown.
and so you want to come up with something brilliant. Like what is the real story here is like how brilliant show weather, man. This is like.
Well,
that
maybe it
brilliant?
was brilliant. Look at all the attention he's received for this. I mean, this is a guy who's injured.
What was he before?
Lightning.
Like.
But I went and I interviewed the cast of Tough 12
Okay.
right when they got into the house, and I remember this is when I started having this very thought. I was talking to Cody McKenzie at
yes.
that time, who nobody knew at this time.
Sure.
And I said, "What is your nickname?" And he said, "It's the Kitty Hawk." And I was like, "Kitty Hawk? Well, what is that?" And he said it was because he was able to, get all the girls. He was able to
Wow.
This was all, as far as I could tell, this was a name he gave himself.
Oh.
And I was like, well, in a context that you're using it, somebody else should have to give you that name. That's like, like, I'm Lothario. I'm like,
Sure,
whatever.
yeah.
It's just, it was silly.
Warren
So you're right.
McDonald,
I feel
right?
like a
He
guy
gave
has to
himself-
sort of earn
right.
it from a coach or somebody in his gym or something. There's got to be some other connection there.
Also, I think we like to think that nicknames are things that came up, in the gym.
Yeah.
When it comes across that you were sitting down and you had this whole equation, show weather, whatever the heck that was, it makes it seem like you're a little too self-absorbed, right? I mean, you're sitting down thinking about your nickname, and trust me, Hector Lombard is one of my favorite people in MMA these days. We're like best buds now. We had a rough
That
patch.
usually
but
happens to you after guys want to kill you.
Yeah,
doesn't
that's
it? Like-
true. So we really patched things up. So I'm not trying to take a shot at him per se. It just reminded me that this is a weird trend in MMA, giving yourself a nickname.
I think we should
Not
come up
good.
with a nickname for Hector. In fact, maybe we should invite our viewers
Well done.
to in the comment section right below us.
Look at you. You want to sit in this chair?
Yeah. Hector Lombard nicknames or nicknames for any of us. If you
Yes. Okay, one last thing while we're talking about nicknames here. The Four Horsewomen have come under fire because they gave themselves that nickname. Now, this is more of a faction nickname, but still, it's one that a lot of people obviously know about the Four Horsemen from the world of professional wrestling. And these four women, Ronda Rousey, Marina Shafir, Jessamine Duke, and Shayna Baszler, are big pro wrestling fans, and they've dubbed themselves the Four Horsewomen. Now, they're getting a lot of heat for this because some of them aren't winning. Ronda Rousey is doing most of the winning as far as this faction is concerned. Marina Shafir just suffered her first pro loss. Jessamine Duke is on a skid in the UFC. Shayna Baszler has yet to win in the UFC. She lost on Tough, but I bring this up because she's fighting next weekend at UFC 177. Should they drop this name, in your opinion, or is this good? People are talking about them. Take the heat and keep rolling with the punches.
Again, it's all about marketing, and if you can market yourselves as something, unfortunately, they haven't lived up to it. So maybe we need to tweak it, like Secretariat and the Three Mr. Eds, or something that's slightly,
The Centaur and the Three Ponies
similar.
is what I call
Right.
it.
What's that?
The Centaur and the Three Ponies is
There
the
you
one I
go.
like.
Yeah, that's something that's actually nicer.
Just so we're keeping it gender.
I think it's brilliant because it just pisses people off. And if you are true bad girls, just keep it
Think
going.
about before Ronda Rousey had got her shot against Misha Tate. Like she basically, I remember Misha Tate accusing her of talking her way into that fight. You got to be able to do this. You got to be now because they came together. How they came together and did this. They're basically just doing it. It's just like, hey, this is something to run with, and you can't guarantee everybody's going to win, but I kind of like it. I mean, it'd be better. It would obviously have more traction if they were all winning.
Right.
Jessamine Duke particularly has just sort of looked pretty bad in her last couple fights, so it would be better if they're all winning. It would give it a little more ominous. Look at us kick so much ass or something, but ultimately that's
They're not making hay, in other words.
You hate it, right?
Can't choose your nickname. Doesn't
Can't
matter.
choose it.
Just can't choose your nickname.
Even as a group.
The rules apply to everything. Groups, people, whatever.
like groups are a little
Who
different.
started calling you New York, Rick?
Everybody. It's like all my friends. It's like liking your own photo on Instagram. There's just something
you do
super
that?
lame about it.
You
Yeah,
can do that?
you can
Wow.
do that.
Weird.
And don't do that.
No, don't
choose your own nickname.
Well, okay, so here's the other side of the coin. This nickname has given Betch Correia like a little angle, right? She did the 4 fingers. If this didn't exist, that fight would have a little less intrigue. So, I mean, maybe they're doing us an actual service by doing these kind of things. I mean, maybe Ronda is ahead of the curve by actually putting these nicknames out there. If no one else is going to run with it, if no one else is going to put that much thought into, personas and angles and factions in women's MMA, maybe we should applaud this.
Yeah, Ronda Rousey is a star, and she could just be out there training with nameless, faceless people, but she's bringing along her training partners sort of, on her coattails, and there's nothing wrong with that. These are people that train with her, help her get better, and they reap a little bit of a benefit from it. I don't have an issue with it. It's marketing, and like you say, there are a lot of women out there who are fighting, and these are the ones we're talking about.
Okay, but how about this? Is she putting unfair pressure on them by linking them up with her? Because everyone's saying like, okay, when Marina Shafir, who's 1-0, is fighting, that's Ronda's friend. When that's Ronda's girl. So by not doing this, they wouldn't have that spotlight on them.
I would see it just the reverse.
Okay.
It's almost like if Ronda Rousey, she was suddenly a star. I mean, she was thrust into this. There's a lot of pressure with everything she does. I almost look at it like delegating some of that pressure the other way. Like she's the one who.
But is that fair?
Well, I mean, it's just I don't know if it's fair or not, but I'm sure the girls that she's with are, that are part of this collective, don't mind that. They don't mind being associated this way with somebody who's at that star level and sort of transcending the sport. I feel like it's just sort of like giving something back the other way.
Yeah, it's not.
I was just going to say that they want that pressure because they want that attention. They come part and parcel. You can't have that attention if you don't want the pressure. So I think that they want it even more than she does, because they wouldn't be as relevant simply without that nickname. She's the only relevant one, to be honest, right now, as it stands.
Well, we'll see. If Shayna can pick up a win, I think she lifts their spirits a little bit. That would be a big fight. In my opinion, the people's main event of UFC 177. There it is. You heard it here first. All right, that does it for us. We'll leave it at that. Of course, a busy Saturday coming up for the UFC. This coming Saturday, there's a fight night in Macau early Saturday morning, and then one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we didn't even talk about, headlined by Benson Henderson versus Rafael dos Anjos. A quick note, we are off for the next 2 weeks because of UFC 177. I will be there in Sacramento, and then the Fight Night show in Connecticut, but we are back a week after that for another episode of the MMA Beat. We'll hope you join us, and as always, leave us a question, comment, thoughts, whatever you want in the comment section below. Love to hear from you. For Jeff, Eric, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching the show. Have a great weekend. We'll see you in a few weeks.